Okay, let's start. Thank you guys for joining. Oh, we've got someone from Texas as well, so we've got people from all over the globe. Thank you for joining. My
Nice.
name is Luke Murray, and I run the Azure Cloud Commanders Learning Room. So welcome. Just for the sake of the recording, these learning rooms are for you guys. They're for you guys to ask questions about your certification. It's for us to share knowledge that we have. Really, it's a good avenue for to help you guys pass your certifications, learn about Azure, a community of people who are just really interested in learning. So welcome. Just some housekeeping before we get started. Be welcoming and respectful to others in the chat. Just be aware of others. Be open to all questions and viewpoints. Be understanding of differences. Be friendly and patient, kind and considerate. If you've got any questions, just raise your hand. And of course, questions in the chat as well. If you're talking to an individual, just mention them. So at Luke Murray, respond to them. And if you are talking verbally, like I am at the moment, just mute when you're not talking. If for accessibility options, you can enable immersive reader, and that will read what's in the chat to you as well. You can enable that. But I'll hand over to Peter. So thank you, Peter, for being our presenter today and speaker. Thank you very much. I'll just stop sharing and you can introduce yourself.
Cool. Well, first I would say thanks, Luke, for having me. Happy to be here, and a big reason why is because it's just I would say an expansion of what I do within Microsoft, providing Azure training to customers, partners all over the globe. It's all virtual, but that's totally fine in meantime. So whenever I get the request to present for like a user group, or in this case, the Learn Rooms, which is actually another part of the team I'm part of in Microsoft, I'm always happy to do that. Now, the challenge was obviously coming up with a topic. So based on what the Learn Room that Luke is managing is doing, it seems to be a little bit of everything, and that's totally fine because the core, as you heard, is about learning, right? Knowing more about how Azure runs, where we somehow decided to come up with a little bit on the updates of app services, partly mapping it with .NET 8, which got launched last week, but it's only 2 slides on .NET 8, and then maybe highlighting some of the cool features, I would say, that I think app services brings forward. And there we go. So starting point .NET 8, because I think it fits from a perfect marketing perspective to talk about .NET 8 a little bit, but you should probably know that app services gives you a lot more than just .NET 8 support. And then once we dive into app services, I got a list of services or features, capabilities of app services that I think are important to know. Looking at it from a pure learn perspective, helping you with certification, you can probably use everything that I'm going to talk about in 104 exam, 204 developing, 305 architecting, a little bit in 400 DevOps. I think those are the most important ones where we touch on app services. So with that, I'll share a bit about myself. So Peter D. Tender, originally from Belgium, but moved to Redmond, Washington area almost 2 years ago. So first week of January, 2 years back, decided to pack up my stuff and move to Redmond to continue the role of technical trainer. So been a trainer for most of my career, but not 100% focused on training. Been a Microsoft, consultant, trainer, architect, originally in on-prem data centers since mid-96 after graduating, building physical data centers, Hyper-V, Exchange, server, SQL, anything that had to do with Microsoft Server backends. Then a little jump to Office 365, and then obviously that's what got me into Azure around 2013. quite hybrid at that time. And then the year after, decided to go for Azure for the full 100%. Then running my own business for about 10 years from 2009 to 2019, and then moved into the Microsoft trainer role, initially out of Europe and then moved to the US team. Been publishing a couple of books, not for the last 2 years, but that's more like a visa relocation limitation. It's not because I don't want to, but I'm not allowed to do that for now. Once my visa got more permanent, I would say, I can start writing books again. So got a huge amount of ideas, a lot of stuff that I want to write on, but not for now. But if you recognize any of the topics where you go like, oh my God, this sounds interesting, and maybe you like the session as well at the end, let me know. Send a mail to Luke or provide some feedback, and then we might give away some of those as well. It's not about me, it's obviously about the topic. So I'm going to use about an hour, but I can stretch it a bit if you want, if there's questions. But first of all, why .NET? I don't want to turn this into a developer session, obviously not, but I think it's a valid question. It actually came up in one of the trainings I delivered this week. It's a 305 architecting, where today we talked about app services and a bunch of other topics, where one of the customers actually asked me like, yeah, why should we move to .NET? Like, what's different? And I was like, oh, that's interesting, because I got 2 slides on that for a session that I'm delivering later today. So in short, it's the new version. It's what we call LTS, so long-term strategy, which means it's the next standard for or the coming 3 years. It also means that if you run an app today on .NET 7, it's officially no longer, well, it is still supported, but in about a year from now, it will no longer be supported. It also means that if you run .NET 6, that was the previous long-term version, you now need to preferably move it up to .NET 8 at some point in time. Some of the highlights that I picked up from the .NET conference last week is better performance. I got a slide on that coming up. There's anything between, I would say, 18 to 24% performance increase. A lot of details on our docs, what they actually measured, how do they come up with those numbers, but performance seems to be a big update. Then .NET MAUI is like the multi-platform developing concept, where if you ever did something with like Xamarin, allowing you to write an app on a full Windows desktop, but running it on an Android, running it on iOS, running it on a mobile platform, you could now do the same using .NET MAUI. So reusing the .NET language and the framework across different runtimes. Then the integration with AI, yes, we need to talk about AI in any presentation we're doing nowadays. It means that you can interact with Azure OpenAI, you can interact with ChatGPT and anything else if it's not running on Azure using the .NET framework. It's cloud native, it can run inside containers, it can run in app services, it can run in functions. And then there's also Blazor, that's another developing concept where it gives you multi-platform, but not really multi-operating system. But you could create what we call WebAssembly. It means running compiled .NET apps in a browser scenario. A little bit what Silverlight apparently was doing years ago, but that's before my developing time. If you want to know more about what's all new in .NET 8, all the categories from the .NET Update article are listed on the left-hand side. So I don't have time because, again, it's not a .NET 8 specific session. And I got 2 links on the other side that I'll share in the chat window as well. So it's a little bit easier. Oh, Luke, thanks for supporting. So that's where you find all the details if you want to know more about all the changes that happened in that framework. The next step is obviously why using app services. So app services gives you a web hosting environment without virtual machines. I picked up 3 numbers from the marketing slides. More than 5 million applications worldwide are running on Azure App Service. If you move from virtual machines to Azure App Services, moving code but not managing the VM anymore, it's going to give you a more than 200% return on investment. Which means that if you would spend like a day on publishing the VM, publishing code, running the website, you could now do that in more than half of the time. At the same time, it's also more cost efficient because running a virtual machine in Azure is still one of the more expensive architecture scenarios. We're now moving that exact same workload in app service would give you a 40% cost optimization. And then the number of hits, okay, cool. Customers are running app service, and luckily they're not just running in Azure, but customers are also connecting to them. But it also goes back to some performance. If you deploy your web apps, I'll walk you through that in a quick demo later on. You can interact with different languages. So you deploy an Azure app service, and it supports multiple languages. I got the most important ones. So obviously .NET, surprise, surprise. If you're a Node developer, Java developer, that's all fine. Python is natively supported. Go language is not in here, but that's where we rely on Docker containers. So yes, you could use Azure App Service to run your Docker containers. Single containers or out of like Docker Compose, where it's building up a collection of multiple containers, that's all supported. Language-wise, that's done, but the underlying operating system obviously is also part of it. You're not managing the VM, but you still need to know the dependency of the platform, where it's Windows and Linux, not only for containers, but pretty much anything. Staging and deployment, another requirement, I would say, for any developer or sysadmin to host applications. One of the features I'd like to highlight is deployment slots. It gives you a quick and easy scenario to not only publish to some Azure App Service, but also allowing you to create like a deviation of that, or disaster recovery, or dev and test staging, production, like 3 different deployment slot environments. And then instead of rebalancing or reconnecting users to one of the different URLs, you only need to perform a swapping operation, where only at the end of the swapping cycle, it's actually redirecting users to the new environment. So it's a bit of a load balancing architecture without the infrastructure complexity of managing a load balancer. And that again should keep developers happy as well. DevOps integration, obviously out of the box. You can integrate with Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions. Those are the 2 options directly out of the platform. If you use other DevOps scenarios, I don't know, Argo CD or Octopus Deploy or any other DevOps tool, I'm pretty sure they integrate with app services as well. They're scaling, but I got another topic on that with a demo on how you could use app services for scale. In all other Azure integrations, identity, where it allows you to add Azure AD or Entra ID now, capabilities without rewriting code. It's a pretty cool one that hopefully I can try to show you as well. The scaling options, there's something new there that I want to show you or highlight as well to make sure that the performance will always be up to the maximum. So a lot of really cool things on and why using app service. The starting point is obviously deploying a new app service environment. So I'm going to switch to my Azure portal. By the way, if you have questions, I think you can post them in chat or maybe raise your hand if that's available in the Teams call, or just open the mic and shout out if technically that works. So I like questions, I like interaction, so nothing wrong with interrupting. So you would go into app service. You would specify any of the options. I'm not going to bore you with the full demo, but if you want to, because you never deployed it before, then more than happy to spend a little bit more time on that. So like pretty much anything else in Azure, you define the subscription, the resource group, and you're going to provide a unique name. So the name is important, and unique means across the globe because it's connecting to that Azure Websites.net namespace. .NET 8 demo. What are you publishing? Are you publishing code or are you publishing a Docker container? Static web apps is a deviation from Azure App Service that you would use for like the static web app frameworks. React, Vue, Svelte, Blazor could be another option as well. Next, you're going to define your runtime stack, like what is the framework? And you can see here that for now we offer .NET 8 as the prime option. If you have 7 or 6, totally fine. And if you still have any of those two legacy ones, I would say watch out a little bit. They're supported, but typically not everything is supported. And that's where I would personally recommend you to maybe look into containers, because they're typically used for legacy workloads. If it's not the .NET family, then you got about the same version numbers, supportability for Java, for Node, for Tomcat. That's the main thing. Which also brings in an important dependency, right? Because now you might have your workload web server running on-prem Windows 2008 with that legacy framework. You're going to move that into Azure, but Azure does not support 2008 R2 VMs anymore. So that's where you have a challenge. You might go like, okay, cool. We're not going to run VMs anymore in Azure. I'm going to use web apps. But now Azure App Service also doesn't always support that legacy framework anymore. So that's where I would say it's maybe one of the watch outs, but I got a potential solution to help you with that a little bit later on. You define the region, like where do you want to run it? Pretty obvious. If your workload has a database dependency, it's now part of the portal deployment. Next is that integration I talked about on the slide, how to automate my deployments of the workload, not the service anymore, but the code actually coming in, where out of the box, it gives you GitHub Actions. So assuming, why can I not select enable? Come on. Not support. Oh, because it's not support.NET 8 yet. Okay, fine. That's fine. Fair enough. It's too fast to talk about .NET 8. That's the message. But if it would be enabled for .NET 7 or any of the other frameworks, it would ask you for your GitHub account. Obviously, you need to authenticate. And from there, you're going to pick the organization, the repo in GitHub, and it will actually create a GitHub action pipeline for you. So it's already becoming DevOps and developer friendly. If you don't have GitHub Actions yet, I would say maybe try to pick it up at some point. A little bit off topic, but I hope you know that GitHub is important for Microsoft, that the DevOps pipelines, the source control, everything that makes GitHub quite interesting has been around for years, and we're just moving it into that app service concept as well. Network-wise, there's not too much you can configure, but it could be useful. What we allow you to do here is interacting with the virtual network layer. Imagine the web app is running as a public cloud service. So if you have something like, this is the web app, and it's connecting to a virtual machine, I don't know, file server or database server. Since this is running in a public cloud, it's going to try and connect to the public route to bump into the virtual machine. So it means that you need to open up some firewalls from the public internet to the virtual machine. What you can do now, it's what we call private endpoints. And it's allowing you to connect to the VNet that you have in the virtual machine architecture, but now connecting from the internal Microsoft backbone. And no longer using the public internet to do that. And that's what you would specify here. Like removing public access is just not running that public Azure websites.net. It would also require that you add a load balancer in front of it to do the same. And then monitoring. There are some monitoring capabilities in app service. I'm not going to break them down, but I think in a full production workload scenario, you probably want to get more insights, which you don't always have from the monitoring piece of the service. And that's where application insights would be recommended. And that's pretty much it. So next, finish, and done. If you don't like the portal because you like command line, Azure PowerShell, or Azure command line interface using Bash, obviously you can do the same, or moving to pipelines, creating the app service instance. Or if even that part is too complex, you could also do that from within your development environment. So if you have Visual Studio, If you want to use this for .NET 8, you need to update it to 17.8, I think. Otherwise, it's not recognizing .NET 8. So I created a little web application. Go. The .NET 8 sample ASP.NET template I used, so nothing too fancy. Where the first part that I walked you through is like what your infra team, the sysadmins, would do, deploying the backend, deploying the service, where now as a developer, you would come in and actually test it on your local machine first, and from there publishing it into Azure. So my app is working, which now means I want to publish it. You go into your Visual Studio Publish, you provide your Azure credentials, publish to app service. Oh, I need to check if I picked Linux or Windows. Linux, obviously, because it supports .NET 8 on Linux, pretty cool. .NET Web App. And publish. There we go. If you go like, okay, Peter, that's cool, but I'm not using Visual Studio, you can do the same with VS Code. Where you need to install the Azure extension. I'm going to load some stuff in here. But once you have that extension, you go into your command palette, and then here you can do app service, and all the steps that you would need to create a web app or publish, deploy the web app are now available from here. So even if you never really used the Azure portal or you don't know command line, you can just go create new web app, and it's going to walk you through some wizard as well. And that's publishing. That's all cool. Good. When you deployed your app service, one of the first things you need to decide on is an app service plan. Now, an app service plan gives you compute power, different flavors to choose from, and also features. You need to decide, partly, I would say, what plan you want to use. There's a lot of details in our Learn doc, so I'm not going to bore you with everything, but in short, you have standard and premium, at least for like corporate running workloads. There's other plans, free plan, shared plan. I would not recommend those for production workloads because they don't come in with a lot of high availability. There's not a lot of features. So it's primarily standard premium. And you also have isolated. Isolated means it's running in a more isolated environment than the other ones. You still get dedicated compute. That's what the service plan also gives you. So you're going to decide, I want a premium plan, P1, 2, or 3, where each plan comes with a monthly cost and with compute characteristics. Apart from compute, it also gives you access to features. For example, built-in backup is part of a service plan, where the difference between standard 1, 2, 3 and premium 1, 2, 3 gives you multiple backups per day. So if you need one backup per day, standard 1 would give you that. If you need, I don't know, 20 backups per day, like every hour or every 30 minutes, you need to move up to a different plan. The deployment slots that I talked about already is also part of standard and premium, where there's a difference between the number of deployment slot environments you can set up depending on the plan as well. You can move from one plan to the other. So you could start with an S1 small plan, move up to premium P3, like the high-end plan. And obviously you can move back as well. And that brings me to the topic of scaling. Because what you're doing is deploying your workload. You got users or customers connecting to the workload. And from there, hopefully your plan will give you the performance characteristics that you need to keep your not only application running, but also keeping the users happy. Like it's a fast performing website. every now and then you might have like unplanned peak load, like during, like in the US last week, Thanksgiving. I'm pretty sure that a lot of websites crashed. Or if you have some artists visiting some concert location, it might also crash the ticket website. And I'm pretty sure you all know the examples I'm talking about. So what you can do is, first of all, being a little bit stubborn, looking at app services from an infra mindset, where you're going to control what's happening. Apart from that, it's not beneficial. Why not? Because you don't want to manage infrastructure. That's why you move to app services, right? So that's where auto scaling is interesting. There's three different ways to enable to use auto scaling. The first one is manual. I don't really understand the concept of manual auto scaling because it's not automatic, right? But I understand the use case. It's where you're going to define that it is okay to deploy more than one instance, from 1 to 5, 50, whatever number you like and you want to pay for. Auto scaling is updated. It's one of the features I wanted to highlight. So we had conditions in auto scaling for years based on a metric. If CPU is more than 70% for the next 10 minutes, please allow me to add an additional instance. If the average CPU load or any other metric for that matter is no longer meeting that requirement, it's okay to remove that instance. And then there's a new version that I'll briefly talk about in my next demo. Oh, look, my app got published. .NET Web App 8, fine. I'm going to use another example where I already have my scaling options defined. So I would go into my app service. I select scale out, meaning you're going to define it is okay to run multiple deployments. Manual is boring because, again, it's not doing anything. It's just defining or allowing you to add another copy, but you need to define when it needs to scale. The rule-based is the one we had for years. So what it means is you go into scaling, you define, like up here, based on a metric. My metric defines if your CPU load is more than 10%. I know it's a silly number, but it was just to show some increase in the instances in an easy way. For X amount of time, I allow you to add one additional instance. The new option now is what we call auto scaling automatic. So it's like dual automatic scaling, right? What it allows you to do here is defining, hey, platform, I allow you to add an additional instance or remove the instance if you no longer need it, but I don't care how you decide to trigger the instance increase. So you're no longer defining the metrics. You just rely on a little bit of AI and machine learning from the platform itself. The catch for now is that it only runs on a premium P2 and P3 plan. If you have standard, you could use the previous rule-based one. If you want to use the automatic one, like fully automatic now, you need to move up to a premium plan. So that's one of the watch outs. I'm going to try and show you what it looks like. So there is, not here. So the next question obviously is like, okay, but how do I know, like, what would be a good metric? The easy answer is monitoring your environment. But what if you don't always have those users? So you can use Azure load testing, where it allows you to create test scenarios. It's using the Java Apache JMeter concept, but you don't need to use JMeter. You can just next, finish and create a basic test. So that's what I did. Create a test where, can I show you the config? So run my test, connect to this public URL and simulate load. based on the number of users or requests per second, depending what the web app is doing. It would be one or the other. I deploy this for 500 users during 5 minutes, and that would allow me to add multiple instances to it. So I'm going to try and spin this up again. I had one from earlier today, but I could run it once more. You all test this one. It flipping around. There we go. So it was simulating load. Response time was like dramatically going up, stabilizing the number of users, and then gradually using the cooldown. And you can filter out from here, like, what is my response time? And then while this is running, at some point, if I remember to go back to it and show you, my number of instances will go up as well. So we'll see how it goes, but at least my test is running. The other part in app service is authentication. So there's a lot of different ways to talk about authentication. I picked out one where I think it's a useful use case where if you're in a migration, but I'll talk about migration a little bit later on. If you're in a migration scenario, like I've been running my web app on-prem, typically in the Windows world at least, your domain, your web server was linked to Active Directory. It gives you the out-of-the-box, what we used to call integrated authentication. It means that anyone connecting to the website on that web server needed to provide domain credentials. Pretty big benefit at that time for developers because they didn't need to know anything about Azure. They didn't need to know anything about Active Directory, and the infra team could still benefit from the authentication. Now, if you have your web server and you're going to move your code into an Azure App Service, I'll show you later on how you can do that. It means that the identity part, the authentication piece, is not part of your source code. Obviously, there are ways to do that. You go into your development environment, you add all the Microsoft identity packages for your framework, your language, and you're rewriting code. But you cannot always do that, or sometimes you don't want to do that. So App Service gives you a feature for any plans, standard and premium, where you can add authentication to the App Service layer without rewriting code. I'm going to show you the Azure AD or Entra ID option, but as you could see from the slide, it supports other OpenID OAuth providers as well. Since my .NET code got published, it is running public. You could try connecting to it. But now I want to make sure that my users, my customers, are authenticating with an Entra ID account. So I go into authentication. I specify my identity provider. I'm going to use Microsoft because it's the easiest to demo, but if you have access to Google, Twitter, Facebook, Apple, or any other OpenID, and you create a identity object or an application object there, you could actually simulate the same thing. Now, what it does in the backend, that's what I want to talk about for a minute. It's performing an app registration. This is where it's creating a service principal. If we have time, I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But that service principal is now translating your application, the app service instance, into an identity object. It's like building a trust relationship between the app service and your identity backend. Next, you can specify which Entra ID or other identity providers can I use. Since I picked Entra ID or the Azure AD new name, I can define only users from my tenant, like corporate users, or anyone having an Azure AD account can connect to it, like partners connecting to Office 365 could be an example. Or it's not just corporate accounts, but also the personal ones. Outlook, Hotmail, that's up to you to decide. So I'm going to use my own tenant, pretty easy. I'm going to require authentication, which now means that anyone connecting to the web app first needs to authenticate before seeing anything. I've never done this for a .NET 8 app, but it shouldn't impact it because it's an app service feature, irrelevant from code. But making demos a bit more exciting, why not? Add identity provider. So this is that service principal app ID that I talked about. And it means, but sometimes I need to restart my app, try in a different browser. So it's still fine. We're going to give it a little kick. Then starting it again. Probably a bit too fast. Might be some caching as well because there's obviously not too much going on. Oh, it's now thinking about it. There we go. That's the Azure AD integration. So now I could connect with my oh wait, I'm gonna try and refresh because here I already have my credentials. Because otherwise I need to like MFA and all that stuff, and I don't want to bore you with all that. If you want to try on your end, the outcome will be the same. Just thinking about it, and then it should ask me for my credentials. Let's try from here. The typical application access consent. And I got access to the app. Obviously, I didn't rebuild anything, so there's no information about like the user profile that you typically see on top, but it's because I didn't rewrite my code. But it worked. Oh, now you're waking up. Okay, I'm not gonna do that twice, but it worked. Good. Next part is monitoring. So there's built-in monitoring capabilities where you can read out all metrics, all capabilities, number of sessions, number of network connections, traffic in and out. You can enable live monitoring. And what we're trying to do with the monitoring features is obviously giving you as much information as possible without giving you access to the virtual machine, because again, you don't have that. Second option, if the built-in is not good enough, but not breaking it down, because you want to get more insights because your workload is a lot more complex, because you do not only have your app service, but you have interactions with functions, you got connectivity to other APIs, you got connectivity to databases and whatnot. And you want to get a lot more details about your application architecture. That's where you would use application insights. I'm going to save you a demo for now, but if we do have time, I can actually bring that back in. Where the next step is migration. Not specifically migrating in a way that you're going to rewrite your app, because that's what developers would probably do, but it's more in like a lift and shift scenario. I have my application workload, my web service running in a virtual machine, on-prem, AWS, maybe even in an Azure virtual machine today, and I want to move it into an Azure app service. Not changing code, not rewriting, not updating the framework, nothing. Literally moving as is. One of the challenges with migration is, how do I know if it's going to work? So what we have in the platform is a service in Azure called Azure Migrate, and it allows you to perform an assessment, like read out my existing environment and come up with a list. What is supported in Azure? On top of that, it's going to highlight the recommended migration. So if you have a web server or any other workload, it's reading out the characteristics of the on-prem VM or the cloud VM. And it's going to tell you if you would migrate this VM as is to Azure, this would be the recommended VM size. It's going to highlight what is supported, what not. You might have a non-supported Azure operating system, like anything that's not 2016 Windows or about the same on Linux. But that's only mapping out the operating system. Where now specifically for app service, there is a subcomponent in Azure Migrate that allows you to perform an assessment for .NET and Java applications. There's a few other workloads in preview or in upcoming preview, I guess. And you could also do the same instead of migrating to an app service, migrating to a container. And I'll walk you through because we do have some time for that. So Azure Migrate is the service in the Azure platform where it's going to allow you to run that assessment, like what are all the workloads I have for SQL, for app services, .NET and Java on Tomcat, maybe some other deviations, but not always giving you a lot of details there. If you have Hyper-V or VMware, that's mainly VM to VM or VM to something else, where now the something else can be an app service or SQL Server. Those are the two ones in scope, or moving to containers. Once the assessment is done, you get a report like what is supported, what not, what is recommended, what's the cost of your app service target environment, running VMs or running app service or running SQL databases. And it also helps you in performing the actual migration. And I'll try to show you some parts of that. Now I'll first show you the backend, but it's in a different account. So let's see if I can switch. Thanks for the interaction in chat, and thanks, Luke, for watching over and answering a lot of them. We can go through if needed at the end if there's more questions. Migrate. So step one, you go into your Azure subscription, you deploy Azure Migrate, so it's just another Azure resource. And then once you have it, you would need to create. Was a bit too fast. You create a migration project, it's just a placeholder or what you want to migrate from or migrate to. If you have virtual machines running, you need to deploy Azure Migrate appliance. It's a virtual machine. There's an image available for VMware or Hyper-V. You download the image, you run it in your environment, you provide admin credentials, network information, and it starts gathering information. That's in short how it works. So in this demo environment, we're running about 200 servers, 99 of them running SQL, 44 of them running some web integration. I'm not going to bore you with all the other ones because it's app service oriented, but these are all my servers in my on-prem environment running some web application. For now, you might go like, okay, wait a minute. SQL demo VM3, why is that running a web app? Because if you run SQL Server, depending on the SQL components, you might still need to install some ASP.NET as well, or maybe something else. Or this one, AirSonic Tomcat, that's like a Linux machine running some Java web application. And obviously, all of them are demo samples, so nothing too important for now. Once you have your assessment done, you can look into some more specifics, and it's going to show you the list of the web apps you're running on-prem, like what is the server. Just randomly going to grab one of these. Where out of my project, like I had 200 servers, 44 web app servers, and now I created a catalog, you could say, where it's 3 IIS web servers. It's going to highlight, well, out of the 6 you have, only 3 of them are supported. It could be the framework, like it's too old, or you could migrate that's ready with conditions. It's going to tell you like you can migrate, but you need to make some changes. It could be installing some IIS hotfix to make it compatible, or removing or changing the port of the website. Like if your internal website on the server is running on port 8080, if you publish it to Azure in the bindings of the web app, it's still recognizing port 8080, but that's not supported in an Azure app service because it only recognizes port 80 and preferably 443. So that's where it's 100% compatible, ready to migrate, or ready to migrate if you make some changes. And then from here, you can actually run your actual migration. So I'm going to show you parts of it, not everything because it takes a while, but I already have the migration done. So I'm running, there we go. Ugh, ugly. Internet Explorer, who's still using that? Scared me for a second. So I'm running my virtual machine. It's an on-prem server. And if you connect to the IP address, oh, it doesn't remember. 963.253. I'm not going to wait for it. Oh, there we go. So it's running a web application, e-commerce, but that's just an example. I don't need this anymore. Good. So I ran my migrate, and one of the steps in the actual migration is downloading an app service migration assistant. It's a free tool, which is always beneficial, I think. And you could run this from within the app service itself, or you could run this from a remote machine. So I just installed it on the VM because it's easiest to demo. It's going to look into your IIS. So I'm running IIS on this little box. And I have 2 sites, my default website and some Azure Migrate container that I'll show you later on. So the default website has a whole bunch of code and it has a whole bunch of settings. And it's a nightmare to figure out behind all these options from 15 years ago, which ones are the ones that I need, the ones that are supported in Azure and whatnot. So that's what your assessment is doing. I'm going to migrate my website or the default one. And part of the assessment is going through all the characteristics of your application. And it's going to highlight what's supported, what not, with warnings, or too bad it's no longer supported and we cannot fix it. Like, why would you try to migrate as is if you know that Azure cannot run it? That's the main message. I'm a little bit fortunate because everything that I have in my sample app is supported. Why? Because it's a pretty recent one. It's a .NET 6. So surprisingly, it should run fine in Azure, right? But to give you some idea, it's going to validate the ports. So again, port 8080 or anything that's not 80 or 443 will be flagged. If you have other protocols in IIS like SMTP or FTP, it's going to give you some warnings. Oops, it's going to look into authentication. So what if you have that built-in Windows authentication that I talked about? It's going to flag it as a warning. I don't use it on this site, but if you would use it, it's going to tell you like, well, too bad. You will lose the built-in Windows authentication if you migrate just the code. So option 1, rewrite and add identity. Option 2, enable that feature from app service. And a whole bunch of other things, right? So it's not only checking 13 options. Those are the 13 that are valid for my demo scenario. I think in total, it's validating like 60 something different settings. Oops. So I know that my web app is supported, where now I'm going to perform my actual migration. I need to copy the code. So this is my device login. I'm not going to do it from here because this is currently Internet Explorer. Close. I'm going to open a new one. Copy the code. Next, it's going to validate my admin credentials, so RBAC, all that stuff. Because you could try to migrate, but if you don't have permissions, then it's not going to work. Yes, I'm trying to sign in. I can hook it up to my Azure Migrate projects. I don't have them for now, so I'm going to skip it. And it's reading out information from my Azure environment. I can use an existing one. I can provide a new name, the migration live, although I'm not going to wait for it. Hook it up to a service plan, the one that I already have, or create a new one. My web workload is relying on SQL Server, which now means that if I move this code as is, it's still going to try and look into my on-prem SQL virtual machine. For now, as part of this migration, I could set up hybrid connection, which means it's going to add some configuration options in Azure App Service to allow SQL tunneling to the on-prem environment. But for now, I'm going to skip it because I already migrated all that. From here, it's going to look into my Azure environment. It's going to create a new app service instance with the correct framework, with all the correct settings, database connection strengths. Anything will be copied over, eventually grabbing the code, publishing it, and running in Azure. Now, I told you I could keep this running, but I already moved that out. And the outcome is, ta-da, the exact same website. Only thing I had to do is go into my app config and change my database connection string. Because it's no longer connecting to my on-prem SQL VM, it's connecting to Azure SQL. So I migrated my database as well. But that's not part of the app migration. That's only moving code. Question there. Why use the App Service Migration Assistant over Azure Migrate? So the Azure Migrate appliance is only reading out the virtual machine state. It's connecting to Hyper-V VMware. It's not looking into the actual workloads. When you perform that migration, well, I closed my Azure Migrate, but when you go into Azure Migrate in the Azure portal, and you select web apps, it's still going to tell you to download that migration assistant. It's not triggered from the appliance itself. That's the main message. Now, the other option, where's my VM? Over here. Imagine that you run through the same assessment, but it's not running in Azure. It's not supported. You cannot fix it because your developer is no longer there or any other reason. I don't know. You still want to run it in Azure because we love you to do that. And that's where there's something new. It's called the container app containerization migration tool. So what that one is doing, it's a PowerShell script. So you need to download it. I'm pretty sure Luke can pull up the link to do that. You're going to run the PowerShell script and it's going to run a validation. Once you've done that, let's see. I might have closed it a bit too fast. Probably this one. Look at that. That's new. Didn't even know that we provided that. I'm going to open it up in Edge for obvious reasons. But if you like that app migration wizard, it's technically doing about the same thing. but it also gives you the full container setup. So even if you don't know anything about containers, but you just want to get your workload moving into Azure, you can do that from here. So it's going to run an assessment. What is the application? It's ASP.NET or Java. My target is Azure containers. It's going to run prerequisites, so you need to install some stuff, validating that it can connect to the internet, all that. Checking for an update. Signing you into Azure, so the credential part is done. It's going to build your Docker file. It's going to create your Docker image. It's going to publish it to an app service or to Kubernetes. And if you don't have AKS yet, it's actually creating a AKS for you as well. I'll keep this running for now because it takes quite some time, but you could already guess that I do have it on the side. So I got my AKS. I created a little eShop container. And oops, it's workload. Shop. My public IP. Here we go. Come on, open it up. We can copy. And it's the exact same workload. If we do have some extra time, I can show you that it is nicely moving on. Every now and then I just need to confirm some stuff. Let's do that. Got a few minutes. Sign into Azure. Let's see where that one ends up. Here we go. It's a bit smarter than the app migration because it opens it up in Edge. Yes, that's me. Then moving on, the demo world, leader, server, localhost, lab admin. Grab my password. Something with the credentials, lab VM, no web VM. Come on, we're almost there. I just want to show you that it's building up the Docker file for my website. Target container, web app or eShop or whatever name you want to give it. Then it will go through. I'm not going to wait for it for now. Good. We did all that. Talked about migration, talked about containers. So the last one, I think, is application insights and monitoring. So the monitoring features, they're there. I talked about it. I'll show you app insights. I'll talk about it. I'll show you. And I guess that's pretty much it. App service, monitoring. I'll grab this one. So what we mean by monitoring is everything here. So you have alerts, you need to configure them, but like if there's performance issues or it's down or anything else that you want to read out, like it's generating HTTP 404, meaning the service is down, let me know. That's that part. Metrics is reading out like the standalone live metrics, CPU load, number of sessions, HTTP requests, storing everything in logs, interacting with log analytics, which means it's typically for the longer term retention and more complex scenarios. But then one of the other cool things is the app service logs. What it allows you to do here is looking into the log files in the same way as you would do inside a web virtual machine, where you could go into Event Viewer, you would look into the IIS specific logs. So you would enable diagnostic logs, store them in log analytics, or store them in a storage account, or one or the other, or both. Flagging HTTP logs, app service logs, that's mimicking IIS and Event Viewer. And from there, once you enable all this, you save it into the storage account. You can go into the log stream, and it's going to show you like the live IIS logging. So that's one built-in option. Another one, it's not really monitoring, but you have the Kudu open source platform, which allows you to connect to the virtual machine in the backend without giving you access to the VM itself. But you can open like an SSH tunnel to the virtual machine, and then cd home or something, where now you have your logs, so the ones that you store inline. You can do site, and then from here you got your wroot, and then you got web app 11, or maybe opening app settings, why not? Not sure if VI is working here, never tried it. Look at that, you can change your connection strings and all that stuff, or looking into the log files and anything else you want to get out of that. So that's another pretty useful tool. Then obviously App Insights, it's like the Rolls-Royce of monitoring. So you can do application map. Why there's no data? Wait, there timestamp. Last 7 days. There we go. So I got my web app connections over here, connecting to a Cosmos database, something you would not figure out from the built-in app service monitoring. Connecting to storage account, connecting to whatever other service, reading out all the performance counters, the failures and whatnot, where App Insights is based on log analytics. So you need to deploy log analytics, you need to deploy App Insights, bring those two together, and then it starts capturing all the data. You can look into the processing of your web application, all the way down to performance counters, failures. I don't have them for now. Well, I should have a few. There we go. So this was like a website where it's creating images, storing them in blob storage, kicking off some functions and stuff. And it's going to show you all the details all the way down to API level. Like, oh, there's something wrong here. And if you want to know what's going wrong, you can see in my application flow, this is a function, but it's an app service, right? It's connecting two blobs. And then once the blob is doing something, it sends it to Azure AI, where now here my API key was broken, obviously on purpose to show you something, and that's breaking the sequence of the app. Where now it's no longer just on the app service, because the app service itself thinks that everything is running fine, but it's just trying to connect to the API from the compute vision, and that part is failing. Without App Insights, it would take you probably quite some time to figure out what's actually happening. I got 2 more minutes because we started a little bit later, and that's closing with security, where I talked about service principles in one part, So you could turn your Azure resources into an identity object. And from there, you're going to reuse your identity object to provide authentication access to other parts in the platform. One option is service principal. Another one actually recommended is managed identities. The big benefit of managed identities is that it's not exposing credentials. It's giving you the client ID, like that GUID number, but it's not showing you the actual password behind it. Once you have your managed identity, you can provide authentication to databases, to functions, to storage, to pretty much anything else in the platform, including Key Vault. Why did I pick Key Vault? Because it's the go-to scenario for your keys, storing secrets, connection strings, anything like that, where instead of storing it hard-coded in your source code or storing it hard-coded in your app settings configurations, you would now move it into Key Vault. So I got one last demo, and then we can open it up for other questions or wrapping it up for today. Out of my app service, I'm going to use a function, but it's the same concept. Inside configuration, that's where before I showed you that connection string for my web app, where now you can actually mix clear text keys or storing some of them in Key Vault. So you need to deploy Key Vault. That's obviously step one. Next, you're going to copy the keys in Key Vault, and you could go like, okay, but somebody still has eyes on the keys. So that's where you would enable key rotation, like running an Azure automation script or an Azure function, or enabling automatic key rotation for like a storage account is one of the services supporting that, where it's going to start with a key that you've seen, like you're the admin, you got eyes on the keys. And then 5 minutes after, or the day after, or every week, Monday morning, it's going to generate new keys, sending them to Key Vault, and nobody knows the actual key anymore. That would be the full architecture. Now, to make sure that your function or any other service can connect to Key Vault, that's where you need to create a service principal or managed identity. Now, within the app itself, where before this was the actual key, it's now telling like, hey, app, if you want to pull up the Vision API key, go to Key Vault, go to this Key Vault resource, and check for the Computer Vision API key. You go into Key Vault. Although I'm the admin, I deployed my Key Vault. The recommendation is to not grant yourself permissions as an admin. Although I did for my secrets, because otherwise I didn't have anything to demo, but the mindset is that the person creating the Azure resource or the DevOps pipeline service account creating the resource will not have access to the data. So if I want to provide access, like my function, my web app, needing access to these keys, I go into my app service. Okay, I need to re-authenticate, that's fine. .NET 8. I turn this into a managed identity, which means I'm going to flag it. I'm going to create a identity object where it still creates the service principal. So that's where terminology is a bit complex. But important, we have our web app service. We turn it into an identity object. We're now in the next step. I would give it permissions to do something. I could do it from here, but that's preview. So I'm going to use the official way. I go into access control, add role assignment, default reader. I used to give this to a user or service principal, where now I'm going to allocate it to my app service .NET 8 managed identity. I go back to my app config. I don't have keys here, but you probably get the idea. I would go into new application settings. This would be the, I don't know, Cosmos DB connection string or something, where now this key would be at key vault, and then in between the HTTPS URL to key vault to the actual secret, and nobody knows what's happening in the backend. That would be the full scenario. If you want to speed this all up, that's the last demo I have, is a service connector. What is a service connector? It's something new on app services. Over here, introduced, I think, like maybe 3 months ago. Instead of going through identity, creating service principal or managed identity, looking into app configs, integrating all the manual steps into Key Vault, this is now fully automated. Create a new service connector. Connect to whatever service in Azure, like I'll connect to storage blobs. This is my storage blob. It's using .NET because that's what my app is using. How do you want my web app to authenticate to the storage backend? Do you want to use managed identities, or you don't know about managed identities, you want to use the old way, just a connection string, or in between, like service principal with credentials? Do you want to lock down firewalling in between, like making sure that only this web app can connect to blobs using HTTPS? Review, create, next, finish, and done. It's creating the service principal or managed identity. It's integrating permissions, role-based access, because here I defined like, yes, you can connect to blob storage, and the assumption is that you need contributor permissions. If you don't like that, you could go into the more advanced options and specifying like blob data reader, something like that. If you connect to SQL, it knows that it's SQL, so it's gonna change the permissions as well. With that, we're over here where I'm a little bit over time, about 5 minutes, but it was a learn room session, so I hoped that you learned a little bit from this for 104, 204, 305 exam. And if not for an exam, then I still hope that you learned something from Azure. Talked about a lot of stuff in just an hour. I hope you liked the pace of it, that it was not too hard. Session got recorded, so if some parts were a bit too fast, you can go back. We can probably share the slides as well because there's nothing secretly on there. But with that, I want to close out. Thank you for being here. If you watch this as a recording, thank you for watching as well. And if you want to stay in touch for the live audience, or again, the ones watching the recording, feel free to reach out. You find me on LinkedIn, send me an email, reach out on Teams. And from my end, I would like to thank you. I would also like to thank Luke for, first of all, inviting me to the Learn Room and present on it, but also the amazing job of providing you with a huge amount of links. This was not prepared. I had no idea he was going to do that. So very appreciated. Thanks for going over the questions. So if there's anything else you want me to ask, this would be the time to do so. But already thank you for everything on that.
I just want to end it by saying thank you very much, Peter, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to run through and teach us all about deploying .NET in Azure App Service. I actually learned a thing I didn't know about the service connectors, so that was quite interesting, and I can see that being used quite heavily in the future. But yeah, I don't think there's many questions in the chat at the moment, so you've been quite thorough. But yeah, just for the sake of the recording, thank you for the Learning Room attendees. If there's anything that you want to know about for future sessions, let me know. Hopefully this is the first of many. So thank you very much, Peter.
No, my pleasure. It was fun. I was happy that time-wise it worked, demo-wise it worked. So
yeah,
more can I ask for?
it's always a good thing. I was in a session earlier and the demo gods wasn't prayed enough, and so the poor presenter had to go through and hurriedly stop, fix that. But it was a really good real life example of how IT works.
You never know. You can prep a lot and then